Welcome to Thinking Deeper by 6-7. Today we are exploring one of the most intense, deeply personal, and polarizing topics in human history, the battle lines drawn between God, atheism, and the symbol of Satan. We're going to examine a fascinating sit-down debate between Christians and Satanists, and then cross-reference that with the incredibly specific, highly literal worldview of the Jehovah's Witnesses, where Satan is practically the main protagonist of the universe. Are we looking at a battle for your immortal soul, or a battle over who gets to write the rules of human freedom?
And before we dive into the deep end of this philosophical crossfire, let's establish a quick ground rule here.
Yeah, good idea.
We are looking at highly polarizing, directly opposing religious and theological beliefs today. So we want to make it explicitly clear right from the jump that we are not taking a side, nor are we endorsing any of these viewpoints. We are acting entirely as your impartial guides, just stepping into the architecture of these different worldviews to analyze the core ideas and, figure out exactly how these different groups construct their reality.
Exactly. That's the mission. We are just here to explore the ideas and see where they take us. And hey, if you like my channel, please subscribe and press the like button, because as we navigate this material today, I want you to think about something deeply personal. I want you to ask yourself, where does your own moral compass actually come from? Like when you make a split-second decision about right and wrong, who or what is the ultimate authority guiding that choice?
Right, because at the absolute bedrock of the debate between Christianity and atheism, we hit this massive defining question. What does the word freedom actually mean, and who is offering it?
Yeah, and that is really the perfect fracture point to start on. When you analyze that sit-down panel debate between these literal Christians and the atheistic Satanists, their definitions of freedom they couldn't be more fundamentally opposed.
No, not at all. Let's look at the atheistic perspective first, because what's fascinating here is that the Satanists involved in this movement, they do not believe in a literal red deity with a pitchfork.
Right, they're not sacrificing anything.
Exactly. They are strictly non-theistic. For them, Satan is entirely a literary symbol. They draw a direct parallel to Prometheus from Greek mythology.
Oh, the titan who stole fire from the gods.
Yes, the one who gave humanity warmth and progress. In their framework, Satan represents a necessary rebellion against absolute tyrannical authority.
Okay, let's unpack this, because the Christian panelists push back hard on that exact framing. I mean, is freedom like being dropped in the middle of a dense, dangerous jungle with absolutely no map and being told, go wherever you want?
Right, which sounds terrifying.
Yeah. Or is freedom having a paved highway with guardrails? Sure, on the highway you are heavily restricted to the road, but those guardrails keep you from flying off a cliff.
That's a great analogy.
The Christians argue that God's rules are those guardrails. They aren't there to ruin human joy. They are there to save humanity from its own inherently self-destructive nature.
Right, and to the Christian mindset, if freedom simply means the absence of constraint, like doing whatever you want whenever you want, that inevitably leads to personal bondage.
Yeah, one of the Christian panelists actually spoke very openly about his past, right? Living with that kind of do what thou wilt mentality.
He did. He chased every personal desire, every impulse, and instead of finding liberation, he said he found himself spiraling into what he described as a literal hell on earth.
Wow.
So true freedom in the Christian view isn't autonomy. It's being liberated from the weight of your own sinful nature through surrender to God.
But the atheists just aren't buying that surrender. They view the story of the Garden of Eden not as a catastrophic tragedy, but as humanity's great awakening.
Right. In their view, eating from the tree wasn't about introducing sin at all.
No, it was the pursuit of knowledge. It was humanity finally opening its eyes. So to the atheistic Satanist, freedom means total, uncompromised autonomy. It's the ultimate declaration of, I am the master of myself.
Which, carries an incredibly heavy psychological burden.
Oh, for sure.
Because if you claim total autonomy, you also claim total personal accountability. You can't brush off a moral failing by claiming, well, the devil made me do it.
Or conversely, God guided my hand.
Exactly. You own your mistakes in this life right now entirely on your own shoulders. There is no cosmic safety net and no afterlife where the scales of justice are magically balanced.
And that brings up a critical flaw in the highway guardrail analogy from the other side. The Christians argue that without a central, unchanging authority like God, morality just becomes completely subjective.
Right.
One panelist laid it out starkly. He said, without an objective, divine standard, saying murder is wrong is philosophically no different than saying I dislike pizza.
That's a wild comparison, but it makes the point.
Yeah, it becomes just a personal preference. It shifts with the cultural wind. If society decides tomorrow that something horrific is actually perfectly acceptable, what higher standard can you possibly point to if you have removed God from the equation?
It is the classic theological trap. I mean, how do you build a universal moral code out of subjective human opinions? But the atheists argue that you don't need a single divine command to know right from wrong. They point to human evolution and sociology. We are fundamentally social creatures.
Right. We naturally develop empathy.
Yes, because a society where people aren't constantly murdering each other is a society where we all get to survive, stay warm, and eat. One panelist even noted that his moral compass wasn't forged by scripture, but by reading thousands of secular books, sci-fi, and fairy tales.
Interesting. So they build their morality on empathy, mutual well-being, and shared cultural narratives, rather than, the threat of divine punishment.
Precisely.
But empathy alone doesn't explain the sheer scale of global suffering. And this is where the theoretical debate over morality violently crashes into reality. I mean, if God is just putting up guardrails to keep us safe, why does the road still collapse underneath us?
That is the million-dollar question.
If God is the ultimate moral standard and is both all-loving and all-powerful, why is the universe filled with so much agonizing pain?
And that question just completely shifts the tone of the room during the panel. The raw emotional pour of this debate really hinges on how these two opposing sides process profound trauma.
Yeah, it got really heavy. On one side, you have a Christian pastor who talks about doing deliverance ministry. He describes witnessing miraculous healings.
Right, people walking into a room with severe schizophrenia and walking out completely lucid.
And he attributes that entirely to the loving, intervening authority of Jesus.
But then, sitting right across from him is an atheist who shares a reality that just shatters that narrative. This panelist worked in a hospital during the height of 2020.
Oh, man.
Yeah, he watched people die horribly, gasping for air, totally alone. And even more devastating, he shares that his own son was murdered.
Which is just, it's unimaginable.
It is, and for him, witnessing that level of arbitrary cruelty stripped away any remaining belief in a benevolent creator. He looked at the chaos and concluded that the universe is entirely cold, neutral, and indifferent to our pain.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it forces us to examine the psychological mechanisms of theodicy.
Right, theodicy being the attempt to answer why a good God permits the manifestation of evil.
Exactly. The atheist resolves the dissonance by accepting that the universe is uncaring. There is no grand plan, just biology and physics.
And the mainstream Christian resolves it by pointing to human free will, arguing that love requires the choice to reject it, which is what introduces evil into the world.
But when we look at the theology of the Jehovah's Witnesses, they introduce a completely different, highly specific framework. In their universe, God is not to blame for suffering because Satan is actively driving the narrative.
Yeah, the JW worldview lays out this incredibly intricate cosmic court case. It's really fascinating because in their teachings, when Satan tempted Eve in the garden, he wasn't just being a malicious nuisance.
Right, it was way bigger than that.
It was a formal legal challenge to Jehovah's right to rule the universe. Satan was essentially looking at humanity and telling them, you don't need God's sovereignty. You can rule yourselves successfully and be just fine.
And Jehovah, instead of instantly crushing Satan and resetting the board, decides to let him try.
Yes, it's a theology built around absolute universal vindication. The Jehovah's Witnesses frequently use a very specific illustration to explain this to their followers. Imagine a classroom where a teacher is giving a complex lesson.
Yeah.
A rebellious, arrogant student stands up and claims the teacher's doing it all wrong, and that he, the student, knows a much better way to teach the class. Some other students listen and decide to join the rebellion.
Sounds like chaos.
It is. And if the teacher just kicks those students out by force, the rest of the class might secretly think the rebellious student was actually right and that the teacher was just afraid of being exposed.
Ah, I see.
So to settle the issue permanently, the teacher steps back and lets the rebellious student take over the class to prove to everyone watching that the student is an utter failure.
Okay, wait. Have to push back on the logic of that analogy.
Go for it.
If a teacher lets a rebellious student take over the class, and that student immediately starts setting the desks on fire, throwing books, and physically hurting the other kids, isn't the teacher responsible for stopping it?
Well, from our perspective, yes.
I mean, in the JW timeline, this quote-unquote class has been going on for 6,000 years of human history, letting humanity suffer disease, global wars, and horrific tragedies just to prove a legal point to a cosmic audience of angels seems like a massive, unimaginable price for us to pay.
It requires a profound amount of cognitive dissonance from an outside perspective, certainly. But you have to look at the psychological utility of that belief for the person inside the faith.
How so?
Well, this narrative is the ultimate stabilizing force. It explains exactly why God doesn't immediately intervene to stop a child from getting sick or a war from breaking out. In their universe, Satan is basically the main protagonist driving the action of human history right now.
Wow, the protagonist.
Yeah. God is allowing this temporary horrific suffering so that the question of his sovereignty is settled once and for all, with no room for future rebellion. It reframes tragedy. Every trial a Jehovah's Witness goes through today isn't meaningless pain. It becomes a vital opportunity to stay faithful and personally participate in proving Satan a liar.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. We've seen how the existence of suffering drives the atheist away from God and drives the Jehovah's Witness to view Satan as the architect of the world.
Mm-hmm.
But if modern atheists literally do not believe that Satan exists, why on earth do they adopt his name? I mean, why not just call themselves humanists or freethinkers?
To understand that, you have to look at the sociological void left by the new atheism movement of the 1990s and early 2000s. People like Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens acted like an intellectual hammer.
They were very aggressive about it.
They were. They were incredibly effective at deconstructing religious arguments and saying, these ancient rules are illogical, they don't serve us anymore. But that movement failed to sustain a community because it was purely destructive.
It smashed the old systems, but left a massive existential void.
Exactly. It didn't replace the church with anything that served human nature.
Because humans are fundamentally wired for storytelling. We don't just need facts. We need rituals, we need a shared identity, we need the neurochemistry of communal bonding. A science textbook doesn't give you a community to mourn with when someone dies.
That is so true. Modern Satanism steps into that exact void. It's often described as a post-atheist movement. They recognize that you can abandon the supernatural belief in God without abandoning the psychological benefits of religion.
Right. They have core tenets based on compassion and bodily autonomy. They do charity work. They have high holidays.
They are essentially hijacking the aesthetic and structure of religion to build a community.
But the choice of the name Satan is still so provocative.
Oh, it's deeply intentional. One of the panelists noted that growing up, absolutely everything counterculture or slightly outside the norm was labeled satanic by the church.
Right. Like Dungeons and Dragons was satanic.
Heavy metal music was satanic. Questioning authority was satanic. So these individuals experienced what sociologists call stigmatized identity reclamation.
So they basically said, if you're going to label everything I love, everything that makes me think, and my entire identity is satanic anyway, I'm going to proudly wear that label.
Exactly. I'm going to forge it into a symbol of self-worth and intellectual freedom. It's a deliberate act of taking the weapon used against them and turning it into a shield.
It is a brilliant piece of cultural judo. But contrast that symbolic literary approach to Satan with the hyper-literal, omnipresent threat of demons in the Jehovah's Witness faith.
Oh, it's night and day.
In the JW worldview, Satan isn't a metaphor for rebellion. He is a literal, mobilized entity. Their theology dictates that Satan and his demons were violently cast out of heaven and confined to earth in the year 1914.
Right, and because they know their time is short, they are furious and they are everywhere. The culture is rife with urban legends about demons attaching themselves to everyday inanimate objects.
It sounds almost like a supernatural horror movie, but this is their daily reality. There are widespread stories within the JW community of a demon-possessed Smurf doll walking out of a kingdom hall.
Yes, or beds violently levitating in the middle of the night just because a Bible student had a garage sale antique or an occult book in their home.
The JW leadership even produces highly polished animated videos for young children where a little boy named Caleb is pressured to throw away a toy wizard figure because the magic in the toy is directly tied to Satan.
The mechanism behind this is fascinating, and it's rooted in a very strict interpretation of 1 Corinthians 10.21, which states that you cannot partake of the table of Jehovah and the table of demons.
And the organization applies this binary to absolutely everything.
Everything. Tarot cards, horoscopes, violent video games, R-rated movies, but crucially, it also applies to any other religious denomination.
Wow, really?
Yeah. If a devout Catholic or a mainstream evangelical claims to have had a profound supernatural vision of Jesus comforting them. The JW perspective is that a demon actually engineered that vision to trick them into staying in a false religion.
Which is an incredibly potent psychological defense mechanism. By attributing a rival's genuine spiritual experience to demons, it allows the group to entirely dismiss the deeply held religious experiences of millions of other people without ever having to genuinely engage with their theology or give them the benefit of the doubt.
Exactly. It functions as a sociological control mechanism.
Right.
By making the outside world fundamentally demonic, the leadership creates an intense phobia of the outside. The mechanism here isn't just a theological fear of the devil, it's the deliberate severing of social ties.
Right, because if you can't buy a used couch or watch a popular movie or attend a Catholic neighbor's wedding without fearing literal demonic possession, your only safe space is inside the organization.
It keeps the echo chamber perfectly sealed.
But think about the exhausting mental toll of living in that framework. If you constantly have to worry that bringing a plastic toy wizard into your house gives a literal ancient demon legal access to terrorize your family, doesn't that make Satan seem almost as omnipresent and powerful as God himself?
It really does. You're constantly walking on eggshells, scanning your environment for invisible threats.
It shifts the entire focus of the religion from the love of God to the pervasive terror of the devil.
It creates a high-anxiety, hypervigilant framework, without a doubt, and it perfectly illustrates the vast, dizzying spectrum we are analyzing today.
It's a huge spectrum.
On one far end, you have atheists wearing Satan's name as a badge of intellectual freedom, using the aesthetics of rebellion to foster empathy.
And in the middle, you have mainstream Christians who view Satan as a spiritual tempter, but focus the majority of their theology on the redeeming, intervening grace of Jesus.
Right. And on the other extreme end, you have groups like the Jehovah's Witnesses who see a literal, mobilized army of demons lurking behind every piece of pop culture, every tragedy, and every rival religion.
So what does this all mean? We've gone from the panel floor of a philosophical debate to the cosmic courtroom of Jehovah. We've explored how the concept of Satan is essentially used as a mirror reflecting humanity's deepest fears and highest ideals.
It really is a mirror.
For the Jehovah's Witness and the literalist Christian, Satan is the ultimate scapegoat. He is the prowling lion that explains all of the world's brokenness, the disease, the wars, and the senseless cruelty. It allows them to maintain their belief in a good God despite a bad world.
But for the atheistic Satanist, Satan is a symbol of self-mastery. He is a tool to build a moral framework in the messy, gray areas of life, prioritizing compassion and empathy without having to bow to an absolute, unquestionable authority. It ultimately serves as a profound reminder of the sheer power of human narrative. The human brain cannot tolerate a vacuum of meaning. We all have to construct a framework to make sense of the agonizing suffering and the transcendent beauty we experience in this life.
And the stakes of which narrative you choose are incredibly high for you, the listener, because whether you view the universe as a literal cosmic battleground between warring angels and demons, or you view it as a neutral, empty expanse where we are entirely responsible for forging our own empathy-based meaning, the way you frame the concepts of good and evil dictates how you treat your neighbors.
It dictates everything.
It dictates how you vote, how you judge others, how you process your own trauma, and ultimately who you are willing to forgive. It certainly does. And I want to leave you with a final lingering question to mull over as you go about your day. If human beings are fundamentally neurologically wired to need stories and symbols to make sense of the world, does it actually matter whether the protagonist of your story is a literal, breathing deity or just a reflection of your own highest ideals?
That's a huge question.
If you removed the labels of God and Satan from your vocabulary tomorrow, would your moral compass point in a radically different direction, or would it point exactly the same way?
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the material. We'll be thinking deeper with you next time.